It's all right to have a good regiment. Where are the men to fight in it?
Wars, they're fought by grizzled old veterans.
Colour Sergeant. Sir.
Like this chap, Colour Sergeant Bourne from the Battle of Rorke's Drift.
Form 2 lines, on the double. Sir.
Except it's just not true. Bourne was only 24 at the time of the battle.
All right, lads. Take up your positions on the firing step.
You're going to enjoy this film, guys. It's full of random trivia like that. You're going to be able to impress your mates down the pub after watching this. Anyway, let's stay on track. Back to the story. The reality is that most wars are actually fought by the youth. Sometimes literally kids. Let that sink in for a moment. Since the dawn of professional armies, it's been young men, and these days women, scarcely out of their teens who've taken up the sword. Like this man, Second Lieutenant John Kipling, son of Rudyard Kipling. He was just 18 years old when he was killed at the Battle of Lewes in September 1915. Contrary to popular belief, his father's poem, My Boy Jack, wasn't actually about John. It was in fact dedicated to this young man, Boy Seaman First Class Jack Cornwall of the Royal Navy. He was just 16 years old when he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross following his death at the Battle of Jutland in June 1916. Despite being mortally wounded early in the battle, Cornwall remained at his gun station long after the rest of the crew were either dead or wounded. Another young recipient of the Victoria Cross was Captain Albert Ball of the Royal Flying Corps. In addition to the VC, Captain Ball was twice awarded the Distinguished Service Order as well as the Military Cross. In May 1917, at the age of 20, Ball lost his life when his plane went down near Douai, I think that's how you say it, in northern France. With 44 victories, he was the United Kingdom's leading ace at the time of his death. Imagine achieving all that by the age of 20, almost impossible to comprehend. So you get the point. Soldiers at war tend to be a hell of a lot younger than war films would have us believe. All soldiers in films, often even the lower ranks, seem to be depicted by men in their 30s or 40s. It makes no sense.
You the new intake? That's right, nice tall fella should do well at PT. Stand up now, stand up, let's see you smile, make the best of yourself.
Occasionally you'd see a young newbie in his late teens to early 20s, but these were always the exception. In reality, it was of course the reverse that was true. These young men were not the exception, in fact it was the old guys who were.
Do you hear that bit, Jesus? Dunkirk? Did you hear it, Clough? Sure, he was still at school at the time.
1962's The Longest Day, cracking film, is one of the most famous war films ever made. It was praised for its accurate depiction of D-Day, yet it also cast actors who were far too old for the roles they were playing. At 32, Sean Connery played a British private. Now we all love Sir Sean, legend that he was, but at his age it would have made more sense to cast him as maybe a sergeant major or a colonel. The film's most profound age discrepancy was casting 55-year-old John Wayne as Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin van der Voort, who was actually just 27 on D-Day. The Longest Day's popularity helped to perpetuate this myth that World War II was fought by older men. The average age of American servicemen killed during World War II was just 21. By the way, talking of American servicemen, I want to say a quick thanks to the man who helped to research and write this episode, James Mace. He's a fantastic author in his own right. He writes historical fiction, and I'll put a link to his work below. We're going to hear from him again in a bit.
This bill will be a giant step forward in the treatment of the insane gambler.
He's a funny guy, isn't he, eh? Do you know who that is? That's Mel Brooks. Yep, the same man who brought us Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein. And he was another kid who served in the war. He was just 18 when he fought in the Battle of the Bulge, which ran from December 44 to January 1945. A combat engineer, his job was to find landmines and to clear booby-trapped buildings, not easy work for anyone. Promoted to corporal, he was placed in charge of a team of sappers. He said in an interview later, "Along the roadside you'd see bodies wrapped up in mattress covers and stacked in a ditch, and those would be Americans. That could be me. I sang it all the time. I never wanted to think about it. Death is the enemy of everyone. And even though you hate Nazis, death is more of an enemy than a German soldier." He later said it was the war that made him get into comedy. If he couldn't make himself laugh, he said, he would have ended up in the madhouse.
It's either a gift of prescience and intelligence or just plain dumb. Plain old dumb. Why, you're in a war,
Yeah.
You just take cover,
And it isn't just these modern wars that are fought by what we would now think of as kids. It was during the Napoleonic Wars the military records were first kept and preserved en masse. Since that time we know that the average combat soldier's age has remained consistent at 22 years of age, with a median of between 19 and 21. One example from the Napoleonic era comes from the British 69th South Lincolnshire Regiment. During those famous battles in 1815 at Quatre Bras and Waterloo, the average age of the soldiers across all ranks in the regiment was 21 years old, and most of those guys had already been with the colours for over 3 years. Staggering, isn't it? But Georgian and Victorian society didn't shy away from this uncomfortable truth like we often do now. Take a look at this painting. It depicts the 28th North Gloucestershire Regiment at Quatre Bras and is by the famous Lady Butler. Here we see one fellow in the front rank who might be a quote-unquote old man in his late 20s, maybe even 30. The rest clearly resemble schoolboys. That poor fellow who's been shot in the head clinging to his mate looks to be about 18. One war film that gets it right is the original All Quiet on the Western Front.
You are the life of the fatherland, you boys. You are the Iron Men of Germany.
Released in 1930, it's based on the novel by Erich Marie Remarque, who served as a German soldier during the First World War. Like the characters in his story, Remarque was just 18 when he was sent to the Western Front, where he saw action in the trenches. His time at the front was relatively brief, but even during that short spell he managed to get wounded 5 times, including shrapnel to his left leg, right arm and neck, which saw him evacuated to hospital for much of the war. The film's main cast were mostly between 19 and 22 years of age themselves, making the actors believable as students at the beginning of the story. The film follows the main characters over the course of the war, with most of them being killed or wounded. Towards the end we see the main character Paul Baumer, a hardened veteran at just 22.
I'm not going. I'm staying here.
Now.
I'm not going to the dining room.
But after the end of the Second World War, the film industry seemed unwilling to cast age-appropriate actors in war films. Perhaps society was simply too uncomfortable to acknowledge the tragic truth. One film that I'm a massive fan of, and that's already been mentioned at the beginning, is Zulu, that classic 1964 British war film. It's a mixed bag though when it comes to the ages of the actors and who they're portraying. Sir Stanley Baker and Sir Michael Caine are in the proper range. Their historical counterparts, Lieutenants John Chard VC and Gonville Brumhead VC, were both in their early 30s.
Now you cut along back to the ramparts with your mates.
Nigel Green played Colour Sergeant Frank Bourne. But Green was nearly 40 when the film was released and stood 6'4" and was built like a tank. The historical Bourne, on the other hand, was just 5'6", self-described in his diary as painfully thin, and was just 24 years old at the time of Rorke's Drift. In fact, I think I'm right in saying he was the youngest colour sergeant in the entire British Army and was known by the men of his company simply as the Kid. Behind his back, I should think.
All right. How far can you rednecks march in a day?
Oh, 15, 20 miles, is it?
Fellow Zulu regiment can run 50 miles.
Dickie Owen, also 37, played the 22-year-old Corporal Ferdinand Schiess VC.
Private Hook!
Yeah.
And remember poor Sergeant Robert Maxfield, delusional with fever, who Private Hook tries to save from the burning hospital? Well, the actor who played him was 38, whereas the real Sergeant Maxfield was just 21. I do have to give the film props though regarding its extras. The director, Cy Enfield, cast 80 members of the South African Defence Force. These young lads depicted the men of B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Foot. And as they were the correct ages, understood drill and discipline, they looked the part.
Now, Maitland! Now's your time!
6 years later, Dino De Laurentiis would follow in the footsteps of Cy Enfield and also cast real soldiers for the film Waterloo. Unfortunately though, despite this, the trend of casting older actors in war films did continue into the modern era. 1998, Saving Private Ryan is one example. Arguably the first film to depict war in all the intense visceral gore and horror, still played it safe with the cast. Tom Hanks was 42 when he played the role, whereas the average American infantry captain in World War II was just 26. But anyway, the trend finally started changing with 2001's Black Hawk Down, a harrowing tale about the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993. Here it became necessary to cast age-appropriate actors in order to show the contrast between the Army Rangers, who tended to be very young, and their Delta Force counterparts, who were much older and all senior non-commissioned officers. An interesting aside talking about casting is despite it being about an American unit in combat, the majority of the actors seem to be British, including Orlando Bloom and Tom Hardy. And this trend of casting younger actors has continued, to be fair. When director Christopher Nolan was casting for the film Dunkirk, he listened to advice of some of the surviving veterans who advised him to cast unknown young actors to make it more realistic. And that's what he did. Personally, I thought that film was massively overrated. What did you reckon? Sam Mendes' film 1917, I personally thought was a bit better, still a bit strange in places, but it does show a realistic looking group of young lads in the trenches, which I appreciate. Since the film takes place in early 1917, just months after the Battle of the Somme ended, you're watching it thinking, I wonder how many of these young men had already seen horrific action on the Somme, one of the bloodiest battles in history. The film was dedicated to Mendes' late grandfather, Lance Corporal Alfred Mendes of the King's Royal Rifle Corps. In 1915, and against his father's wishes, Alfred left his home of Trinidad at the age of 17 to join the British Army. In his own words, he wanted to fight for king and country. He served at the front for 2 years before being invalided back to Britain after inhaling poison gas. He was awarded the Military Medal for acts of gallantry and devotion to duty under fire. At the time, this was the British Empire's third highest Valour Award for enlisted ranks, below the Victoria Cross and the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Despite his injuries, Lance Corporal Alfred Mendes did lead a long and fulfilling life, becoming a novelist and only passing away in his 90s. So anyway, why is it that so many veterans throughout history are so damn young? Well, there's many factors to consider. Partly, of course, it's because it's a bloody physically demanding profession. And also, if you're in it for the long haul and you want to do your 20 years, you best start young. And let's be honest, the young also tend to be far more impressionable, susceptible to recruiting, posters, adverts, films and other pop culture references.
Proud of you.
And at that age, we all think we're bulletproof, right? I've been in many war zones, from Iraq and Afghanistan to Ivory Coast, Gaza, Ukraine and Libya. In my 20s, I lived for it, couldn't get enough. Now I get sick when asked to go. I don't want to risk not seeing my kids again. I guess that's just what happens when you get older, settle down and take out a mortgage. The same has held true across history. Spartan men were required to join their regiments at the age of 20. During the Roman Empire, potential recruits had to be at least 17 and no older than 25. In the modern British Army, the minimum age you can volunteer is 16, though of course you do need parental permission at that age. Their American counterparts can join at 17. Something to keep in mind is that our brains as human beings are not fully mature till we're at least 25. Now, I'm 46 and I'm not sure mine's fully matured yet already, but there we go. Yet despite this, nations send their teens off to war. Now listen, I'm not knocking it, somebody has to fight, but this is an uncomfortable truth that nations are still grappling with. My good friend James Mace, who co-wrote this episode with me and did most of the research, was 29 when he went to Iraq. His father Donald, on the other hand, when he went to Vietnam, just 19.
When I got sent to Iraq in 2004, I was 29 years old. I was a staff sergeant E6 in charge of an infantry squad. And at that age, you're older. You're an old man. I had some life experience. I did not think I was bulletproof. And I cannot begin to fathom how different my experiences would have been were I a 19-year-old kid like my dad was.
We didn't even know where the rounds came from at first. And we saw a group standing about 10 feet away and we got him.
By the way, before we wrap up this look at the age of soldiers throughout the ages, I do want to point out one recent outlier, and that's Ukraine.
Якщо ми зараз це не зробимо, то прийдеться нашим внукам братися за зброю.
The average age of a Ukrainian soldier on the front line is a staggering 43. Now, I don't know what the reasons are, but a quick trawl through the web seems to point to an ageing population and the fact that Ukraine has been slow to introduce full conscription. Perhaps these days, older men are the ones with the most energy for fighting. At risk of sounding like a curmudgeonly old git, I do find my younger colleagues often do lack a bit of energy, and it's us younger guys who end up pushing them to work harder. I don't know if you find the same thing. Comment below if you do.
But these young fellas nowadays, they haven't got the stomach for it. Because the young chaps now, they can't fight.
Anyway, the sad truth is wars are inevitable. But before we go to war next time, just have a think about who it is that's going to be doing the fighting. All will give some, and some will give all. Now at the beginning we mentioned the film All Quiet on the Western Front, but I'll leave you with the opening lines to Eric Marie Remarque's legendary novel. It says, "This is neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war." So I hope that hasn't left you too depressed, guys. Lots of good stuff coming up in the near future. I've got a fantastic interview with a man called Todd Bracestead about loyalists during the American War of Independence. I'm looking at the Salonika campaign in World War I and lots of other interesting stuff. Please be sure to subscribe, like, leave a comment. I'll see you next week.